Hello, everyone. This is Whitney Will from StarHearth Astrology, and we're going to talk about the Aries full moon that happens on October 17th, 2024. Normally, during this time, the first lunation after our two eclipses would be a kind of, okay, back to normal things happening. Let's all rest a little bit after the shakeup of eclipses. Maybe we're still dealing with some of the things that they brought on, but we're back to our normal scheduled programming. That is not true for this full moon. This is a really complicated full moon, so we'll get into that. I'm going to start by actually going back to yesterday, Monday, October 14th, talking about some things that happened that day, and then looking ahead through the rest of the week with an extended stay, talking about our full moon on Thursday. So yesterday we had two pretty tense aspects. We had the sun squaring Mars. And now this is a really interesting aspect to be talking about because the sun and Mars have to do with how we push our will out into the world, what we like being and doing and being secure and feeling empowered in those things really have to do with the sun and Mars. And the square that they had yesterday was the sun challenging Mars in that square aspect, creating conflict, but both of them are in the signs of their fall. So Mars is in its fall in Cancer. It's already entered the shadow of its retrograde. We're seeing the kind of frustration build up with that. And then the sun in its fall in Libra comes and squares that. So if yesterday was really disempowering, or you had a hard time harnessing your energy to be productive, right? It's a day that has a fair amount of pressure, but is not supported very well. If you had that kind of day of feeling really low energy and it was hard to find the motivation, even though I had plenty to do, the thing to know about planets in their fall is that the only movement is upwards. We can see Monday with the sun square Mars and the moon in Pisces, very emotional, that kind of a day. Now, that wasn't all that was happening. We also had Venus opposite Uranus. And Venus again is in Scorpio in the sign of her detriment. She rules that Uranus in Taurus, and they went head to head. And that can be the like something's got to give feeling. So now we're frustrated and we feel like we've got to change things up because this isn't working, right? Venus Scorpio, sometimes she wants to be a little bit possessive. Sometimes she wants to be a little bit controlling. And opposite Uranus, Uranus is saying that's not the way to true safety, right? Constantly going into the dark, constantly saying, well, okay, I just need to root through one more shadow before I can come into this Taurian space of being able to relax and feel secure and be present with what's happening. Yeah, there's never going to be enough. As we move through this week, we're seeing Venus process the end of Scorpio. Big Venus and Scorpio vibes, not just that, because Mars plays a really strong role this week too. On Tuesday the 15th, we spend the whole day building up to a trine between Venus and Neptune, right? Filled with fantasy, filled with an opportunity for connection. But Venus is in Scorpio, so she is more likely to have a kind of maybe fantasies about danger, a little bit more pessimism in that, especially because Scorpio, as one of the signs that Mars traditionally rules, Mars is in Cancer in its fall. So Mars is feeling disempowered. So the Scorpio spaces can be struggling a little bit. And now Venus is trying to help it along, but she is not really empowered in Scorpio either. So that trine with Neptune, I think that can also feel like a little bit of despair. And right, part of despair is a Neptunian experience because despair is in many ways a delusion. Despair is basically this moment of hubris of saying that exactly what is going to happen. And what we know from astrology, what we know from our own experiences, is that time keeps going and different things happen. And the idea that we need to despair because something that feels out of control or feels heartbreaking is going to happen, right, is a cute little delusion of our mortal lives, right? Terrible things are going to happen, right? Part of this project is the negotiation of suffering through our mortal forms, suffering through the truths that in order to be on this planet, sentient and alive, other things die and suffer, and to reconcile ourselves with human nature, which is so often greedy or avoidant or violent to ourselves and to each other. And so despair, right? I'm not against despair, and I am far from preaching toxic positivity, which is also a delusion, right? I'm just saying, right, like it's a moment. It's a moment. And we can indulge there. In fact, we should indulge there to allow our bodies and maybe our tears to process these moments that feel overwhelming and that feel filled with fear and that we can't see beyond them. And the great thing is that we don't have to. But I would say with Venus trining Neptune, it's also an opportunity to pull down those barriers between us and other people. Neptune helps things dissolve, and Venus does want to connect, especially when we're talking about these water signs on this heart level. Call somebody in your despair, and you don't have to rage about it, like spewing it, but really, if you are in your heart in a place of grief, connect, share space with somebody who is a good listener and who's not going to try and move you out of what you're feeling, because if you are truly processing it, you will move out of it anyway. Okay. The other thing that happens on Tuesday is that the moon goes into Aries, where we're going to have our full moon. So we are at the kind of peak pressure of the month, the peak tension of the month where something's going to blow, and it probably is based on this full moon's chart. And maybe that Venus trine Neptune is the breaking of the wave of, oh my gosh, with everything happening, I just can't contain it right now. And so it's, yeah, let go, cry. It's a great alignment for a kitchen floor cry. Yeah. So then Wednesday, we still have the moon moving through Aries, and on Thursday, we get a couple things. So Thursday is a kind of complicated piece of different stuff. So it's going to be Wednesday night that the full moon happens, but it's really Thursday morning. The peak moment of the full moon is 4:26 a.m. here on the West Coast. And I'm going to pull up the chart for this full moon, and we're going to walk through it a little bit. Okay, so here is the chart for the full moon in Aries. We can see the sun is down here at 24 degrees of Libra, opposite the moon at 24 degrees of Aries. And the full moon in Aries is always ruled by Mars. And when we look at Mars, what we see is that we've got configured to this moon, squaring both the sun and the moon in the sign of its fall. The moon and Mars are in mutual reception, which is to say Mars is in the moon's sign, the moon is in Mars's sign, but they're not having a good time. This full moon, this kind of blowing point. This is the seat of restlessness and dissatisfaction, right? A moon in Aries wants to be free to take initiative, to move where it wants to go. It's this burst of individuality and inventiveness. And it's ruled by Mars that is in many ways held back by Cancer because it's too emotionally complicated to be able to move that swiftly through the world. Because Mars in Cancer has caretaking obligations, has protection obligations, is sensitive to the emotional responses of other people when Mars is taking action. Like the crab, if you watch a crab move, it can't walk forward in a straight line, which is how Mars would like to figure out what it's doing and then just move forward from here to there. Crabs move sideways. Light bends in water. It is not a straightforward path. This is very frustrating. This is a very frustrating full moon. And it may be even a little explosive. And part of that is Mars is moving in, and really for the rest of the month is moving into an opposition with Pluto. And this opposition with Pluto is part of what characterizes our Mars retrograde. So it'll happen 3 times, but we're spending the rest of the month kind of moving into that. And this is, the word for this transit is like going nuclear. If Mars is super, super sensitive in Cancer, fairly emotionally reactive, and Pluto has a tendency to blow things completely out of proportion because Pluto is where we get triggered. Now we've got Mars on a hairpin trigger in Cancer, opposing Pluto, creating this kind of grand square with the full moon, right? This is complicated. This is a lot of tension to hold. At the same time, we've got Venus also ruled by Mars opposite Uranus, separating from that opposition, but they're still in that sign-based thing, right? We're still ready to cut our losses, risk some estrangement. We really don't know what other people are going to do. And unfortunately, this full moon extends for much of the rest of the month until we have a Scorpio new moon. Now in the US, of course, we are dealing with the last weeks of the election. And I'm seeing this really politically, in that sense, very complicated. We're in the last months of Pluto in Capricorn, which means we're in the kind of final phase of the Pluto return of the United States. And we've got Mars really duking it out with Pluto as part of the story. How are we going to negotiate it? And what's interesting about this is that here they're doing it in Cancer and Capricorn, but that won't be the full story. Because when Pluto goes into Aquarius, then we're not having the Pluto return of the country, of the Declaration of Independence, but we're having the Pluto return of the Constitution, which came about with Pluto in Aquarius. And we will have Mars challenging the Constitution from right there. Yeah, complicated stories. Now, there are some protective factors here, I think. We have Jupiter trining the sun, and so offering that kind of stabilization and support, right? Trying to tip the scales a little bit, perhaps, of being like, okay, we're going to wait and see. Jupiter is also in its detriment, but Jupiter in its detriment doesn't make Jupiter bad, just makes it a little bit more problematic, right? There can be a little bit of doubt, a little bit of analysis happening, right? Jupiter stationed retrograde is still at the degree of its retrograde. I don't really like trying to hold things together. but not super confident in how we're all going to make this happen. 10th full moon. And I'm not saying this to fill you with more despair, but to be aware of the explosive nature. So if you are going to poke a bear this week, conversation wise with somebody or other things, I would know that this is what is in the skies, and possibly taking a step back, taking a deep breath, and trying to lean in to something else. Or if something needs to be blown up, put your foot in your mouth to do it, but just don't be under any illusion that you will be able to control the impact, because you likely will not. Okay. Harsh. Now, I want you to notice, though, that Venus is at the very end. And this full moon happens close to the end of Aries. What I feel really good about is that by the time we get to midday, really, it's like 12:30 and 1 p.m., we have Venus going into Sagittarius and the moon going into Taurus. And what that says to me is that these planetary bodies that are about connection and comfort and feeling of safety, they both get a glow up at the end of this harsh Mars. And that is Venus moves into Sag, so she's moving out of the sign of her detriment into a sign where she's a little bit happier, a little bit more optimistic. She'll also be in a sign-based aspect to Jupiter that rules Sagittarius. So we've got the benefics, okay, doing a little bit of damage control. And that damage control doesn't necessarily look like soothing Mars, but it looks like the perspective shift of, okay, that didn't go well. What did we learn? How are we going to approach this differently? At the same time, basically, we have the moon going from that hot, intense Aries into Taurus, into the sign of her exaltation, looking for some comfort, some safety. Whoa, let's recover from whatever that was. Like, let's, I don't know, get some lunch, take a breath, and realize that we had some really intense things to release. So it goes to start looking for safety. And again, the moon moving into Taurus, its ruler, Venus, is no longer in Scorpio. She is in Sag. So that bodes well as well. And that's most of what we have for this week. The moon will go into Gemini on Saturday, right? At the full moon, we switch from the waxing phase of the moon to the waning, but we still got a week of just dealing with everything until we have the third quarter of the moon. That happens on Thursday, the 24th, by which time we will already be in Scorpio season. That's what I got. Stay present, feel your feelings, be kind to each other. I don't know, trust the process. And if you want to work with me and do some readings, I would so love that. Okay, have a good week, everyone.